It's great to have you with us this morning. The ushers are going to come forward and receive your offerings. We thank you for your generosity and would like you to remember your free pancakes as they pass you by. During this month of summer, we're talking about movies. And we started last week. Tyson talked to us about Guardians of the Galaxy. And what we're trying to do throughout this series is, we love movies, we love story. They shape our imagination, they move us, they affect us. How often in life you find yourself in conversation with someone and something they say leads you to say, oh, you've got to watch this particular movie because this speaks to you. I think film and cinema has become the way in which we deal with our concerns. It's the way in which we unfold some of our stories as people in this kind of present society as it is. So what we're doing throughout this series is we're taking particular movies. They're not movies that we necessarily endorse. They're not movies that we necessarily say you should take home and show your children. They're movies from which we can learn things, from which we can see how the worldviews and stories that are held inside of these movies might teach us something. Or how perhaps we as Christians might look at one story and say, okay, I understand how that story is being told, but I have a series of different ways of thinking about it because of my faith and my following of Jesus. Kevin Costner once said that the power of movies is that they can actually be about things that you don't realize they're about, and then you never forget it. You sit down to watch a movie thinking you're going to learn one thing or enjoy one thing, and something else captures you and speaks to you and directs you. The movie this morning is a recent movie, came out at the end of last year, called Hacksaw Ridge. It's the true story of Desmond Doss, a private played by Andrew Garfield, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. The only person throughout the entire war that managed to win the Congressional Medal of Honor without taking any violent part in the war. He never fired a bullet throughout the entire war, refused actually on the basis of his faith. He believed his Christian faith meant that he should never hold a weapon. So he actually made it through basic training in the army without ever actually touching a gun. And he just refused to do this. So this caused him problems. And you see, if you watch the movie or if you have seen the movie, his fellow soldiers ostracize him. They push him out because he takes this pacifist stance. But he goes on earning their respect because of his bravery and his selfishness. Because without firing a shot, at the Battle of Okinawa, he saved 75 men. Interestingly, he chose to save injured men, not just American men, but anyone who was injured, he chose to try and save them. And stayed in the midst of a pretty fierce battle without a weapon, saving lives. So this makes the movie Hacksaw Ridge. Well, this and some Hollywood glamour and the obligatory romance that gets added to the story as well. Now, there's very many things that you might struggle with when you watch a movie like this. There'll be aspects of the movie that you might find yourself uncomfortable with. The movie takes a classic sort of American bias that those of us north of the border or from the proper side of the world get a little bit frustrated with from time to time, that basically the assumption is that anything America does is right. And I'm very aware that war movies can also sort of float underneath them a sort of political bias that sort of wants us to work a particular way. And so when we watch certain movies, we always have to be aware of and alert to, what is this movie trying to convince me of? What is this movie trying to justify? And sometimes, and maybe you notice this, old movies about things that happened a long time ago can actually be speaking politically to things that are happening right now. So it's very rare that a story is told to you as just a story. There's often something going on underneath it. But I want to sort of move away from kind of nervousness about talking about political issues or looking at the political goals of this particular movie. I wanted to talk about it for different reasons this morning. At one level, an easy thing to talk about a movie like this is to try and deal with the issue of violence in Christianity. And I think we've found that a complex issue over the years to where does the church stand in regards to war and violence. I think that Peter Leahart said it best when he said that the church is actually called to be a community at war with violence. Our challenge as the people of God is to always be uncomfortable around violence in whatever form it takes. And even when some people throughout history have made choices about how the church relates to violence, our core level as followers of Jesus should be to follow Jesus in the way that he works out a disregard and a stepping away from violence as a way of going. However, the reason I actually want to talk about this movie this morning is because of a particular premise that it wrestles with, a premise that I think all of us wrestle with on a day-to-day basis. Because I think this movie and Andrew Garfield's character, this Desmond Doss, this true person from history, works as a little bit of a metaphor for the Christian life. You see, because underlying the whole movie with the awkwardness of war, with the terror of war going on in the background, you get this story of this young man who disregards war, who doesn't want violence, who doesn't want to do harm to anyone else, but operates from the premise that the best location for him to be is out there. He works with a missional premise. He assumes that the best thing for him to do, even though he abhors what's going on, is that he should be in that location. He sees it in the movie as his national duty, but he sees it as the working out of who he is. Now, this is actually quite important for those of us who follow Jesus, because we follow Jesus, who is an incarnational God, a God who was here with us. God didn't operate salvation from a distance and he just sort of pulled his few strings and sorted things out. But actually what we find is that God was amongst us. And this becomes a model for how we live our Christian lives, by being people who are amongst other people. Karl Barth said it like this in his famous church dogmatics: humanity has not fallen lower than the depth to which God humbled himself for them in Jesus Christ. No matter what mess we find ourselves in as humans, the Bible story brings us to Jesus, who is absolutely there with us. It's not a theology of how low can you go, but it's a theology of presence. It's a principle of mission that says our call as Christians and followers of Jesus is to be amongst the places that we have problems with. And oftentimes there's been a temptation to actually, as the church, step away from difficult things and say, oh, this is awkward things that are going on here, or we disagree with what's going on here, so we'll just hide out in our church and be okay. And churches have lived like this for a long time. This premise and assumption that our job is to simply be the church, keep away from all of the awkward stuff, and everything will be okay. Now, if that was good theology, my movie this morning would be Field of Dreams. And this premise has actually affected a lot of churches over the years. The kind of tagline of that movie was, if you build it, they will come. And Christians have actually lived with that for a long, long time. As long as we just do the right stuff in this room on a Sunday, everything will be okay. And that's kind of moved into our everyday life, where being a Christian simply involved working hard to one day bringing a friend to church. And if you could just get that friend to church, then maybe something someone said or something that was sung or a pancake would actually bring them to Jesus. Actually, all of those pancakes might just bring you to the doctor, but what Hacksaw Ridge shows us is a story of a person trying to work out their faith in entirely the inverse of that. A person trying to figure out, how does my faith work in the context and presence where there are many things going around me that I disagree with, many things that I'm uncomfortable with, but I still feel that I should be there working out my faith. Now, at heart, I think we all wrestle with this. You may not have had to face the call of war. You may not have had to face the decision, should I go and fight or should I not go and fight? But all of us who follow Jesus have at some point had to deal with the question, how do we work out our faith in public? How do we do what we do? And over the years, what we've done in Christian theology and in Christian living is we've started to separate our faith from everything else. We call it the sacred secular divide. We have sacred things in our life, the things that we believe in, our Bibles that we read, certain Christian actions that we do, the going to church. And we compartmentalize that in this bit of our faith in our world where we say, this is where we do that. And then the rest of the time we have secular things and we just go about doing life as normal. But I think there's a question underlying maybe a movie like this, and there's a question underlying our Christian discipleship that asks us constantly, how is my life as a disciple of Jesus impacted by that fact? How does the fact that I follow Jesus affect every part of my life rather than just the so-called sacred stuff? See, because when we divide stuff into sacred and secular, it actually kind of seems like it works for us, but causes problems for us in the long run. We think about secular jobs versus sacred jobs. So you might say, well, David, you're a pastor. That's a sacred job. Like, I don't know what people think a sacred job is, involved in just probably just working one day a week and praying the rest of the time or something like that. At least that's what I've heard people say, But over here we have someone and I have a secular job, and that means, I work at a bank or I work at McDonald's or I do something that is not holy. And what we do is we divide life up and we say, well, that's the holy things and these are the non-holy things. And then it allows this sort of group of people over here to go about their life doing normal things, and then this group of people over here doing holy things. And that's why when we holy people make mistakes, we think it's a bigger deal than when we make mistakes. And also it's why we don't see responsibilities to Jesus that we see them having. Well, that's okay for you because you're the pastor, but actually I don't need to worry about that because I'm not a pastor or some other type of holy person. But actually this is a pseudo-dualism because you never see this in Scripture. There's no such idea in Scripture that one job is particularly more holy than another job. The followers of Jesus are simply called to follow him. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, we say. And then we go, wait a minute, we even have a Bible verse. So we have John 17. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. And we quickly roll out that text and say, no, the secular is over there and the sacred is over here. This is where we do holy stuff, and we've got to stay away from all that nasty, unholy stuff. You spend too much time with a pagan, you might turn into one, But of course, this is a highly redacted reading of Scripture. This is a reading of Scripture that has blocked out all sorts of things. In fact, this is a reading of Scripture that's blocked out everything around about it. Jesus says this in John chapter 17, if you read the whole passage, I have given them your word. He's praying at the moment to the Father. And the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Yes, we say, exactly. We're different, sacred, secular. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world. Oh, okay. But I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. And as you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. See, the call of Jesus is for us to work out our following of him in our day-to-day, everyday lives. Jesus leaves us absolutely in our culture and society. And it seems that the previous 2,000 years of the church have been our attempt to back out of that. It's as if Jesus sent us, and we've been trying to put the car in reverse ever since. If we can just get this shifter back in reverse, back this thing up a bit, because it's safer living separate. It's safer saying that's holy and this is not. But Jesus didn't call us to that. Jesus might say that our core identity might be different. Jesus might say that the following of him moves us to different life choices and different ways of doing things. But what he never does is lets us say we're not living here. Christians live in the world just as much as anybody lives in the world. Christians live in society just as much as anybody lives in society. And here's the piece. That's actually where Jesus called us to live. He called us to live present in our surrounding world. The scholar Joanne Brandt says this commissioning of the disciples is an indication that the gospel envisions some sort of universal mission rather than narrow sectarianism. And actually, I think sometimes we've narrowed it even more than just a particular group. We've narrowed our Christian faith right down to even to just particular parts of our lives. That there's bits of our lives that we say that can be affected by Christianity, but other bits don't. And for us, I think the wrestle in our day-to-day existence is what does every aspect of our life look like if we're truly following Jesus? You might want to call this the sacred presence. That everywhere you go is holy space. That everywhere you go is sacred space. Because you see, a faith that has nothing to say to the wider aspects of our lives, I'm not sure has anything to say at all. A faith that has nothing to say to how you are at work, and a faith that has nothing to say to your work, needs some serious examination. Because it just seems to be largely useless other than just for the occasional prayer and something to do on Sunday mornings. Now, we got to be honest. Over our history, sometimes the church hasn't worked in a particular way that what we do on Sundays seems particularly interested in what you do on Mondays. I get that. Sometimes we've listened to sermons and we go, well, that's nice and I feel cleverer now, but I'm not sure how that's going to work when I meet my boss in the morning. Because some of you perhaps are thinking about your boss and thinking, no, he's definitely not holy. But the question is, how does the faith that you have impact the business deal that you're currently making? How does the faith that you have impact the financial choices that you're doing? Does it even impact the places that you choose to work, the people that you choose to deal with, the way that you work these things out? Does your faith make any difference there? Because in this movie, as I was watching it through, it's fascinating to watch this young guy try and wrestle two almost unwrestlable things. This war machine that's going on in the Second World War and his loyal faith to Jesus. And he wrestles to bring the two together. And I feel like this is a metaphor for us that we should wrestle with in our own lives. What does it look like? What does your life look like? To think about following Jesus as something that has day-to-day impact. Now, we make this like hugely complex sometimes. We make it hugely difficult sometimes to figure out how to follow Jesus in our day-to-day lives. And we say, okay, well, what if we were to try and do sacred deeds in your workplace or sacred deeds in your school? You know, immediately you start thinking, do I have to start wearing a cross now? Do I have to put a placard up or a banner? I don't have to shout in the street, do I? Or something like that. And sometimes we make it overly complex, and we want signs from God, and we want some sort of prayer of confirmation that proves us. I've met Christians like that. They say, oh, well, I'll say something, or I'll do something, or I'll practice my faith if God gives me the go-ahead. If I get the right sign, if I get the right moment from God, then I'll know he's supposed to do that. Kind of pivotal moment in the movie where the retreat has happened and the American soldiers are piling off down to safety, and Doss, this character with no weapon, all of a sudden feels this is the wrong thing to do. And he has this moment where he wants a sign from God. You know, God, tell me what to do. And then there's this moment that perhaps all of us can relate to at some point in our following of Jesus. This moment where he says, I can't hear you. You know, which often raises the question, what does God sound like? How do we see God? How do we hear God? And then if you pick it up over all of the explosions that are going on in the background, Doss hears someone in the distance crying out for help. And his response to God is, all right. You see, there's two stories in the Old Testament. There's a story of a man called Gideon, and there's a story of a man called Moses. Gideon has this moment where God comes and speaks to him and says, I got something for you to do, Gideon. And Gideon responds like most Christians by doing this. Well, okay, God, if you do want me to do something, I need you to do some signs, right? So I'm going to put a fleece out on the floor. If it's wet in the morning and the floor is dry, I know that you are calling me. So sure enough, in the morning, the fleece is wet and the ground is dry. And Gideon says, well, that's great, God. But tell you what, let's just be really sure. Tomorrow morning, I'll put the fleece back out. If the ground is wet and the fleece is dry, then I know that you are calling me. And in the morning, the ground is wet and the fleece is dry. And Gideon realizes that God definitely is calling him. And God says, well, I was the first time before all the tests, but And bizarrely enough, we've taken this language, perhaps you know some older saints, you'll hear this time, we laid out a fleece. And this story's become a model for many of us to how we hear from God. We make God do some sort of test, and that proves that he wants us to do something, despite the fact that Gideon's behavior isn't approved of by God. This isn't the way he wants us to work. Instead, in the story of Moses, God calls Moses and he says, hey, I need you to do something. And Moses says, how can I do that? And there's this beautiful moment where God says to Moses, but what is in your hand? You see, sometimes it's just where we are. Sometimes it's just where we happen to be. Sometimes it's just the situation we find ourselves in. And we want some supernatural sense of God till we know this is right. And actually, sometimes it's just somebody crying help in the distance. What if God is simply asking you to do something surprising right where you are? What if God is asking you to work out your faith, not in any great, impressive, world-changing way that will be written about in books in the future, but what if actually he just wants you to hear those cries for help in your own workplace, in your own street, amongst your own family? Mother Teresa said it like this, whenever I meet someone in need, it's really Jesus in his most distressing disguise. She was often asked, how do you do the things you do? How does this lady work in such terrible places? And this was her secret, to realize that God speaks to us, that God appears to us, that God comes to us, but often not in the places that we would imagine him. Or perhaps a slightly different quote from Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor. When wrestling with the same question, where do you see God? How do you find God? How do you bring God? He said this, it's so simple. Which is not the answer you expect, right? It's so simple. You see a musician in the street, you give him 10,000 francs instead of 10. He'll believe in God. You see a woman weeping, smile at her tenderly. Even if you don't know her, she'll believe in you. You see a man forsaken, open your heart to him, and he'll believe in himself. You will have surprised them. Blessed is he capable of surprising and of being surprised. But you see, this is true in the New Testament as well. In the same way, Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, live such good lives amongst the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. You see, if we take this seriously, our presence is important. Where you are right now is important. The street that you live in, the family that you're part of, the place that you work, the club that you go to, the sports that you do, all of these places put you somewhere where your sacred deeds, the actions that you make there, are impacting actions. They help people, they guide people, they direct people. You are more than creative as an individual that you don't need me to tell you what kindness is. You don't need me to tell you what it looks like for you to practice God's love in your context. But if we keep thinking that sacred is something that happens over here in church and then the rest of our lives just work out as and when we can figure it out, then we're missing this beautiful call of Jesus to be present where we are and be his people in that context. We used to assume, perhaps, that sacred deeds involved inviting people to church. Sacred deeds involved getting someone on their knees beside their desk at the office, confessing Jesus. And then we would think, oh my goodness, I can't do that. So we just hide out in our office and hope no one ever asks us what we do on Sundays. But what if actually following Jesus in your workplace was just looking for God on your street, your workplace, your school, just looking for him, seeing the opportunities to be somebody that follows Jesus, showing kindness, showing grace, showing compassion. Of course, this does raise a slightly other important issue that I found myself wrestling with as I watched this film. Is if we are willing to live out our faith in public, if we're willing to be kind, generous, compassionate people, if we're willing to be Jesus followers in the places that we work, what you might also find is that's not roundly welcomed. It often appears strange to work out a Jesus-following life in wider society. Not the kind of weird Jesus-following life that sometimes people have tried to walk out, but just being the sort of people we're talking about. Being the type of people that sees Jesus in everyone. Being the type of people that actually realizes that every moment creates an opportunity for you to live out your life differently. For Doss in this movie, it raises problems for him when he tries to work out his following of Jesus in his real life.
So how come you don't fight? You think you're better than us?
No.
But what if he was attacked?
Whoa!
Say it like that. Bible says to turn the other cheek, don't it? Yeah, see, I don't think this is a question of religion, fellas. I think this is cowardice. Plain and simple. That right, Doss? Well, go on. Take a poke. Tell you what, I'm gonna give you a free shot. Right there. Hit me, Doss. Go on.
Let him have it. Go ahead.
No?
Maybe you've been in a situation at some point where, well, let me put it this way. Christians can act in particular ways in public that does create awkwardness for themselves. And sometimes they deserve that awkwardness because the behavior is weird. We've all met weird Christians, right? Yeah. So I get that. But actually sometimes just doing what's right, doing what's compassionate, doing what's kind, doing what's loving isn't always welcomed either. Thinking about the other before yourself, thinking about the impact of all of our actions sometimes puts us into difficult places. Eugene Peterson, in his wonderful book, Run with the Horse, he says it like this: faith is not a leap out of the everyday, but a plunge into its depths. If you're really going to follow Jesus, you find yourself deeply immersed in your life, but it's not always going to be popular. Society has a tendency, maybe you've picked up on this, most people learn it around about 5 or 6 years old as they start school, that society has a tendency to insult what it doesn't understand, to snap at what it's not comfortable with. If something's different, you'll notice that society's first point is not often to go, wow, something different, just what we've been looking for. Normally, it's point, laugh, and make it seem stupid, right? And the prophets in the Old Testament show us a way of living that I found myself constantly reflecting on as I watched this story of this young man, Desmond Doss, where the prophetic role is to come along into a society and offer an alternative. In the trailer right at the start, you saw Doss saying this really poignant sentence where he said, in a world tearing itself apart, it doesn't seem like a bad thing to put a little bit of it back together. And the prophetic role throughout the Bible is to come into a world tearing itself apart and say, actually, maybe we can put this together differently. Maybe God involves himself in our society in different ways. And if you're going to work out your role in your life, perhaps like Desmond Doss, you find yourself as the kind of awkward prophet. That you find yourself present. You got to be present if you're going to be a prophet. We talked about this through our Edge of the City series, if you remember when you were with us. We talked about how the prophet's presence is important. And so Doss is present. He's amongst these warmongering sort of soldiers that just want to get guns and do some shooting. And here he's there, awkward, out of place, not looking like he's supposed to be there, demanding that he's not going to pick up a gun. The tradition of the prophets in the Old Testament is to imagine a world that is different, but as God hopes it to be, and then to follow the call to bring that into existence. Now, this is awkward. It's difficult. The call to live out your faith in your street isn't easy. The call to be a follower of Jesus in your workplace isn't going to be straightforward. But if you can live that truth, if you can work out that truth, if you can be the type of person that seeks compassion, that seeks care, that thinks of others before yourself, then that creates a disruptive effect. This disruptive effect in this movie happens with this man without a gun running around a battlefield as bombs are going off and as explosions are happening, and he's saving lives. He's putting things back together. It looks totally weird. As you're watching the movie, you find yourself not breathing properly at times because you're thinking, this is such a weird scene. All of this killing's going on, but the story that you're following is somebody trying to put it all back together in the middle. Now, I don't know what's going on in your workplace, in your street, in your family, in your school. And none of us do, apart from how you perceive it and understand it. But what if the call to follow Jesus involved being an awkward prophet, being a disruptive person that's actually saying, instead of just ganging up on that person who we don't like, what if we brought them in and welcomed them? Instead of ignoring that sort of thing over there, what if we paid attention to that? Instead of being cold, what if we were loving? Instead of being unkind, what if we were compassionate? Sherry Hodde Miller says this about prophetic disruption. Prophetic disruption is not simply a matter of speaking hard or unpopular truths. I think what makes a message truly prophetic is its audience. Prophecy disrupts the particular audience God has given you. So here's the question. What truth do you bring to your audience? Where has God placed you? Where is it in history that you find yourself? Where is it geographically that you find yourself? You find yourself a particular moment in a particular place. And sometimes that can feel accidental. If we were all to sit and tell our stories, perhaps as you're having a pancake outside afterwards, you can tell your story about how you got here. And it probably will feel random at times. It definitely won't seem as planned as you would have liked it to seem. There'll be moments of your life that seem out of control and you go, well, I'm here. I've had a lot of conversations in the last sort of few months since I've moved here. And an amazing amount of people that go, I never thought I'd still be in Calgary, or I never thought I would be coming to Calgary, or I never imagined leaving there. And we find ourselves here. But what if your presence is exactly where God wants you to be? What if where you find yourself right now is exactly where God imagined you to be? Because he wants you to be that awkward prophet, speaking truth into that situation, being clever with it. You know, it's much harder to live out following Jesus in your workplace than it is on a missions trip. It's much harder to do it amongst your family than it is amongst people that don't know you. Because they're watching you all the time, always alert to what you're doing. And here you are trying to live out your faith in a way that makes a difference. Jesus warns us in Matthew chapter 10. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep amongst wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Maybe you've seen this movie before. Maybe you'll go and watch it now. That's your choice, what you do. But this thing that really struck me was how much hard work it was for this young guy to actually not carry a gun through this war. The accusations of cowardice, the people saying you're taking the easy way out, you're just doing the easy thing. And actually quite the opposite. What you feel as you watch your way through this story is this was the hardest thing for anyone to do. The easiest thing at any point for anyone to do is just what everyone else is doing. And this story calls us, perhaps in the same way that Jesus is always calling us, to a different way of living. A way of living that might be difficult, that might be hard, that might not be straightforward, but is the way of following Jesus. So, perhaps not the thing that often comes to us when we watch a war movie, but two things I want you to take away from this morning. The call to prophetic presence and the call to prophetic awkwardness. Be present. Doss exemplifies the flawed attempt to live life out within the sphere that God has placed him, and also living true to the principles that God's called him to. Now, hopefully you never find yourself in a war situation. Hopefully you never find yourself wrestling with, should I or should I not pick up a gun? But the attempt to be present where God has placed you and work out the life that he's called you to is probably all of our everyday challenges. So this story is actually all of our stories. And maybe there's a sort of call for us then, that whatever you do, whatever it is you find yourself in, be present, but tell a different story. Let your life tell the story of Jesus. Let your life tell the story that calls people to another way of being human. Work out your sacred in amongst the rest of the world by doing what it is that God has called you to do. Can I pray for you? Father, I thank you for all of the beautiful stories that come together into this room. I thank you for what they represent. And God, we all find ourselves in different places. Perhaps it's a tough conversation that's ahead of us this week. Perhaps it's a difficult work situation. Perhaps it's a hard family life. Perhaps our street is just not in a peaceful place sometimes to live. And God, I want to confess prophetically that all of us find ourselves where we are because that's where you put us. So give us the strength and courage. Give us the strength and courage to live out your life as you would call us to do it. Give us the strength and courage to be different, to be people of love and compassion and care. And help us to follow you wherever it is that we find ourselves. Amen. May God's grace and peace be on you this week.